America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on the Russian political opposition to Putin's rule. Our guest is Vladimir Milov, a Russian opposition politician, publicist, economist, and economic advisor to the Russian opposition leader Alexey Navalny. Mr. Milov served as Russia's Deputy Minister of Energy from May to October 2002. Prior to that, he was an advisor to the Minister of Energy and head of strategy at the Federal Energy Commission. In 2003, Mr. Milov founded the Institute of Energy Policy think tank. He has been a vocal critic of Vladimir Putin since leaving Russian government in 2002, and currently hosts regular talk shows at the Navalny Live YouTube channel. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and Boris Yeltsin was elected the first president of the Russian Federation. Yeltsin quickly pursued radical reforms to transition Russia's communist economy to a market economy. The reforms destabilized the country and threatened the power of former members of the Soviet political class. In 1992, Yeltsin's vice president said the reforms were causing economic genocide. Facing internal opposition, Yeltsin used force in an attempt to dissolve the Russian parliament in October of 1993. The 10-day conflict was the deadliest street fighting in Moscow since the 1917 October Revolution. Russia's GDP contracted by nearly 30% from 1991 to 1998. That year, the ruble lost 2/3 of its value, and Russia defaulted on its debt. Amid the financial instability and privatization of former state enterprises, select Russian businessmen acquired vast amounts of wealth and power. These oligarchs provided ideal conditions for an autocrat to consolidate power among a small political and financial elite. President Yeltsin resigned due to internal pressure in 1999. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin became interim president and was elected president in 2000. President Putin instantly recognized the connection between foreign policy and popularity at home, and ferociously prosecuted a war in Chechnya against separatists and terrorists who had attacked Russian civilians. Though that war caused massive civilian casualties, it inspired praise in Russia and only weak statements of disapproval from the West. President Putin revived Russia's nationalist mission to protect himself from internal opposition and restore Russia to greatness. He combined disinformation and deniability with disruptive technologies to intimidate neighbors and subvert Western democracies. Putin also cultivated economic dependencies, especially on Russian-supplied energy, while brandishing and using improved, unconventional, conventional, and nuclear military capabilities. The color revolutions in Georgia in 2003, in Ukraine in 2003 and 2004, and Kyrgyzstan in 2005 clarified Putin's fears of opposition to his consolidation of power. Although the color revolutions and protests in Moscow were based on the population's desire for freedom and improved governance, Putin saw U.S. and European hands behind them. In response, the Kremlin jailed and murdered numerous journalists and opposition leaders. Yet despite Putin's efforts, the progressive protests across the former Soviet states reached Russia. In 2012 through 2013, widespread protests contested official election results, claiming Putin had won 63.6% of the vote. Protests returned in 2017 and 2018, and massive protests again erupted in the summer of 2019 following the removal of opposition candidates from the ballot in the Moscow City Duma elections. On February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia's war on Ukraine is the greatest threat to stability in Europe since World War II. Even so, President Putin's actions demonstrate that his rule is fragile and dependent on brute force and terror. There are more political prisoners in Russia now than at the height of the Cold War. He has enacted Soviet-style restraints on freedom, imprisoning thousands of protesters and criminalizing dissent. We welcome Vladimir Milov to discuss the Russian opposition, the internal and external threats to Putin's grip on power, and the impacts of Russia's aggression on the world.
Vladimir, welcome to Battlegrounds. I cannot think of anyone in the world I'd rather have a conversation with right now to help us understand not only what's happening in the world, but to place, this catastrophe, this crisis in Ukraine in a broader historical context. And for our viewers, I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about our shared history, at the end of the Cold War, because we're really, I think, seeing kind of a new era emerge that we maybe have not acknowledged for some time in terms of the competition with an authoritarian regime in Russia. But I was a cavalry troop commander in 1989, patrolling the East-West German border. Our troop was patrolling that border when East Germany lifted travel restrictions to the West, and we saw the Iron Curtain part, right? And then we saw the Berlin Wall fall, and we personally witnessed, tens and then hundreds and then thousands of East Germans flocking across the border, bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine, and there were hugs and there were tears of joy, right? And hey, the Cold War was over. Authoritarianism was over, right? And there was a new dawn for democracy. Hey, Vladimir, maybe tell our viewers where you were on the other side, right, of that Iron Curtain in 1989 and through 1991. What was your experience?
Well, thank you so much, General, for doing this, and really happy to be part of your show. And yeah, I just turned 17 in June 1989, exactly when Solidarity in Poland won the elections and formed the first non-communist government. You can imagine what a tsunami this was. Poland, Hungary, East Germany falling apart. Then came the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and right before the new year, Ceausescu regime fell in Romania. We were absolutely overwhelmed by these events. And for all the people who wanted change in the Soviet Union, that created a lot of tailwinds, because we thought that if Eastern Europeans were able to do it, then we can also do it ourselves. And then a couple of years later, Soviet regime fell as well, which is an absolutely historic celebratory moment, and a moment for real opportunity, which unfortunately, looking back 30 years, we missed, but not completely. We still managed to experience some degree of freedom, which will be useful in the future to build a normal democratic Russia after Putin.
Well, Vladimir, let me just thank you on behalf of everybody in the free world for your courage and your determination to advance, the rights of the Russian people, and to be a strong voice against the authoritarian regime in Moscow. So let's maybe begin with that. Let's go back to 91, right? You mentioned Romania. I was an exchange student in Romania in high school, right? So I saw Romania under Ceausescu. It kind of redoubled my determination to serve in the military, right? To on the front, what I viewed as the frontier of between freedom and authoritarian, totalitarian regimes associated with the Soviet Union, in particular the Warsaw Pact. But I think what a lot of Americans want to know these days is, hey, how did this happen, right? I mean, it was an optimistic period in the 90s, right? We'd won the Cold War, right? And so what was your experience as a young person in Russia, in the 90s? And we would just love to hear your thoughts on, like, how the heck did Putin come to power, and why are we where we are today?
Well, first I have to say that for those of your viewers and listeners who understand Russian, I made a specific cycle of videos on my YouTube channel, actually describing the real 90s, not the 90s portrayed by the Putin's propaganda, but how exactly we lived during this time. These were difficult times, very troubled times. I have to say that the average cost of Urals oil was less than $17 per barrel during Boris Yeltsin's years. So the current Russian rulers would have died from a heart attack in 30 seconds if oil have cost like that for a decade. There was a pretty chaotic time, but also a time of freedom and a time of hope. And believe it or not, when Putin arrived as president in 2000, there was no idea among the majority of us that we'll ever slide back to authoritarianism. There were really worrying early signs, but generally we thought that, listen, it's not possible. We have been a democracy for well over a decade now. So how could this happen? And unfortunately, I think we obviously underestimated the strength of authoritarian restoration. Well, we didn't read Fukuyama too much these days, but many people say now that it's Fukuyama's fault while creating all this rosy, hopeful atmosphere.
Well, let's be fair to Frank, right? He's one of my colleagues. He had some caveats, as you know, in that people don't discuss. But you're right. For our viewers, what we're talking about is this idea that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy, right, of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems, right? I think what you're saying, Vladimir, is we were over optimistic, right, in this period. Do you think?
No, I think that really Francis Fukuyama offers a lot of really thoughtful and complex analysis. Most of it is spot on. But this catchy slogan, like the end of history, like we don't have to, you know what was the major problem of the 90s and Putin's dictatorship restoration? That people sort of let it go. We thought the job is done. Now, the hard lesson is that democracy is hard work. Protecting it from authoritarian restoration is hard everyday work that everybody should focus on. We never completely protect. Can happen in democratic countries, even EU member states like Hungary. Authoritarian restorations can happen, which we are seeing today. So this is something that, you know, the Soviet Union fell relatively easy for most people who were fighting for democracy inside Russia. We didn't really pay a heavy price for 91 revolution. And we thought like, oh, well, this is a gift and this is something that's going to linger forever. We should have understood more about hardcore institutional work to be done every day. And we had no idea that authoritarian restoration just doesn't happen overnight. A dictator never comes and says, we abolish democracy, I'm the single ruler from now. No, it's just a very gradual process, like, you know, a frog that is slowly boiling, you know, in cold water. When you have a system of judge appointments reshuffled one day, one independent TV channel is shut down the other, but people say, you know, but we still have a lot of independent channels. So this, you know, step by step, gradually, in several years' time, you found out that, bang, you're trapped. So we were really too idealistic, and we did not raise the alarm, and we did not do the institutional homework to protect democracy on all levels, local, regional, federal, parliamentary system, judiciary system. Now, that's a hard lesson, but I think right now the good news is that we know it. And the conclusion is that next time we're going to have much more experience about that to try to build a much better functioning democracy in Russia.
Yeah, Vladimir, this is such an important point. I think, you know, we can't take anything for granted. And, you know, I think in our history, I mean, our founders, the founders of our republic, they knew this, right? And they knew that our republic would require constant nurturing, right? And I think that sometimes these days we're too pessimistic because we don't recognize, hey, in a democracy, what's great about a democracy is you actually have a say in how you're governed, right? You have a process for improvement short of revolution. But could you maybe talk about some of the signposts along the way? What were some of the most important events in your memory and your experience that saw, you know, the nascent democracy and free and open system in Russia, go away? I mean, what were some of the key events in that period of time under Yeltsin, and then obviously since Putin has taken power?
Well, first, I have to say that a lot more was needed to be done in terms of enlightening people, the Russian population, because they really were tired of chaos, not only of the chaos of the 90s, when many people speak about that, they really forget the chaos of the previous decades. 70s and 80s was not an easy, rosy time. It was a very difficult time. We had to struggle for basic food and supplies every day. So a few decades of very chaotic, turbulent times. Many people were actually seduced by the idea of, a strong leadership, a strong man coming and solving all the problems. You don't have to do nothing. Just surrender your basic civil and political rights, and this good daddy will do everything for you. I have to say that this idea was pretty popular in Russia even before Putin emerged as a major political leader. These ideas, after all the difficult times of the 90s, were circulating around a lot. Like I would cite opinion poll done by StateOwned pollster in November 99, 60% of the population had answered that they would prefer if military or paramilitary people take over the country to restore order, to establish order with a strong hand. That was pretty popular. This is actually one of the reasons why Yeltsin ultimately picked Putin as a successor. He was sort of satisfying the demand. So I think we haven't done enough to enlighten the population to actually not getting seduced about these sort of ideas of a strong man in power. It always ends up bad. Now,
Vladimir, I just want to thank you because I think education is almost a precondition for democracy, right? And that's what this whole podcast is about. And hearing you say that is, I think, extremely powerful. So, I think an educated populace is a requirement, for an effective, democratic form of governance.
Yeah. And the second thing I wanted to say is exactly what you mentioned, General, about the founding fathers and the American system and American Constitution, because you have separation of powers working.
Yeah.
Now, we didn't have that in the 90s. We had some form of freedom, but that was like sort of a volleyball, between parliament and president, the winner takes it all system, right? So everybody was fighting for total control of all the institutions. We didn't build, and we didn't really appreciate what separation of power means. That absence of separation of powers leads to authoritarian capture. So I think, again, next attempt to build democratic Russia, this is what is needed to be done from day one, to establish totally independent branches, judiciary, parliament, regions, local self-governance. Unfortunately, we didn't have that. We were sort of building this overly centralized vertical of power under Yeltsin since the beginning of his rule. Essentially, Putin became his heir in that he just inherited the system which was very convenient for total power grab. That was a mistake. Separation of powers is a precondition for normal democracy.
This is such an important point, and our founders, of course, they learned from history. Like Russians, I think will be able to learn from history. And what our founders had in mind were the bloody wars in England in the 17th century and the rise of Oliver Cromwell. They said, okay, let's not do that, right? Let's figure out a way within our Constitution to separate powers and provide these checks and balances. And, it works pretty well. Vladimir, I know that, you probably watch us engage in a good deal of self-flagellation here in America, associated with kind of the vitriolic partisanship that we've seen, associated with, the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. But our institutions really held up in that period of time, right? Because you had, the legislature did what they were going to do, right? What they needed to do. The judiciary did what it needed to do. So how do you see, Russia today, right? Explain to us maybe what happened because of the failure of no checks and balances between the year 2000 and the year 2022, right? The 22 years of Vladimir Putin's rule. How did that happen? How did Vladimir Putin come to power, solidify power, consolidate power, and then engage in, I think, what we can all now see pretty clearly in retrospect, a sustained campaign to reassert, the Russian influence over the former territories of the Soviet Union, and to to pursue his agenda internationally as well as internally.
Well, again, I have to reiterate that Putin was simply a product of his time. There could have been absolutely a different person in his position, which had probably done the same.
Among the Siloviki, right? Among the former KGB security class of people.
Exactly. Not only them. I would say a large part of Russian elite, even the civil folks who were never part of military or paramilitary structures, had this revanchist imperialist views. And generally, what happened in 1999, 2000, when Putin just emerged as a new leader, we had on one hand a very inexperienced, politically weak population, which was tired of political turbulence and not really experienced and even bothered, with democratic processes, sort of chaotic thing. And on the other hand, we had this predatory mafia-style nomenclatura, post-Soviet elite, which understood this and wanted to do a power grab, exactly Putin's style. What is important, I'd say probably more important event than Putin's election as president was what happened the next year, the year after in 2001. Which was the merger of two rival bureaucratic parties, which seemed to be at odds in 99, pro-Putin Единство and Отечество headed by Evgeny Primakov, the former prime minister, and Moscow mayor Yuri Lushkov. In 99, they seemed to be bitter rivals, but soon it became clear that they have the same agenda. They have very same imperialist, revanchist agenda. They wanted to centralize control over economy, major assets, and financial flows. They wanted to restore centralized governments, so they merged into one party, United Russia. That happened in the middle of 2001. Since then, they won supermajority in parliament, and dictatorship was signed and sealed. So it was nomenclatura, predatory post-Soviet mafia-style elite versus the tired and unexperienced population who sort of easily given up, particularly on the background of significant economic growth under Putin, which was a result of both successful end of reforms and growing price of oil. So that was like a perfect storm for the Russian society and a perfect opportunity for a power grab. Again, I would say it could have been somebody else. There were many people in this nomenclatura who actually wanted to do this, and they were eager and swift to join Putin's monopolistic dominant ruling party.
I mean, what a great point. Like I have not heard this, Vladimir, in many of the books I've read. I mean, this merger of the parties is really not, it's not covered in any detail, I don't think. And it's the story is mainly about, the Siloviki, the former security people and military people really taking power away from Yeltsin granting power to them on New Year's Day in 2000. And, I think that, but we did get Putin. You said it could have been others, but it was Putin, right? And of course, Putin, I think, laid out his agenda in that speech that he gave on New Year's Day in the year 2000. Of course, he doubled down on it in the Munich speech in 2007, right? But he got to work almost right away, right? Meddling in Ukraine's elections, the denial of service attacks on Estonia, and of course the invasion of Georgia, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. But in between all of those egregious actions, and sort of examples of aggression, there was a sustained campaign, right, to subvert the West and to restore Russia to national greatness. Can you sort of hit some of those milestones and maybe talk a little bit about your personal experience? Like, so you mentioned, okay, you were 17, right, in 1991. Now you're witnessing in your 20s that there's this period of consolidation of power, right, by these kind of revanchist, revisionist elites. What was your view? What were you doing? And what's your understanding of the period of Putin's rule, right, from 2000 to 2022?
I was 17 in 89, but in 2000, when Putin was elected president, I was already 27. And I was heading the department in one of the federal regulatory agencies, Federal Energy Commission. This is the analog of American FERC, electricity and gas markets. I was heading a major strategy department there. And listen, that's important for Americans to understand what time that was. I was like a mid-level official in the Russian government, and I was obviously openly against Putin, and I voted for the other candidate, Grigory Yavlinsky, and I openly said it. It was allowed. That was late Yeltsin time. It was absolutely okay to criticize the sitting president and vote against him in elections, just so you have an idea what time that was. Now, clearly, since Putin was appointed prime minister in August 99, it was very clear that he's actually aiming at turning around all these major decentralization trends and agendas that we were putting forward. I was part of the reformers bloc in the government, which really looked forward to do more decentralization of political and economic power, more power to the regions, to local communities, privatization and exiting control over state property and major state corporations. Now, Putin was showing clear signs of reversing that trend. I wouldn't go into a long description because you can read a brilliant book by Catherine Belton called Putin's People, which describes all this process, and it heavily quotes myself as well. So I'm one of the most quoted.
So it's definitely a good book. No, I love that book. It's a great book.
So if your listeners want a more detailed explanation, I think they should go and read this book. But the bottom line, first Putin's years were sort of a struggle. And the oil was also cheap, and it was not guaranteed the economic growth would stay. So he was sort of flirting with the idea of reforms, democracy, and so on. Now, I can tell you a story. When I already left the government, but I was still informally advising German Gref, the economic minister and major reformer, sometime in early 2004, when Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of Fed, he actually gave a speech saying that we have now entered an era of an exceptionally high prices of oil. And oil jumped to $50 per barrel back then for the first time ever. So Gref called me, asked me to come to his office, and actually looked at me and said, what's your take? Is Greenspan right? Are we really into an era of a high-priced oil? But in his eyes, I saw a totally different question. The real question was, can we now allow ourselves much more than we ever previously thought we'll be able to do? So that really untied a lot of hands in the Kremlin. This newly accumulated oil wealth really helped to unleash all their imperial ideas, which were contained by economic weakness of Russia.
Right, and we should note too. Could you summarize as well, like the state-owned companies, right? I mean, so that Russia gets, the government gets direct access to these profits because of the statist economic model that survived, right, with Gazprom and Rosneft, in the post-Soviet period.
Exactly. We had these terrible disputes about that in the government 20 years ago, and it was a lot of trendy, fashionable idea of like South Korean chaebols. We're going to build a handful of state monopolies owned by the government, and they will be the drivers of economic growth. Now, I said, folks, you're crazy, because monopolies are lazy, monopolies are non-transparent, monopolies are corrupt and non-efficient. They will simply rob the country and deprive us of economic growth further down the road. Well, this is actually exactly what happened later, right? But then Gref, Putin, everybody, Kudrin as well, they were absolutely fascinated with this idea that we need to build a handful of national champions who, like heavy horses, will drag our economy forward into a better future. That was a huge mistake, but that was a part of Putin's post-Soviet centralized thinking. These people really believe in centralized control over everything. That is, on one hand, their religion, and on the other hand, a very powerful instrument of enrichment through corruption, because you control all these financial flows, you get a prize with the ability to build all these, luxurious palaces on Black Sea.
No, this is so darn important. What you're saying is so incisive, right? These authoritarians are obsessed with control, right? And you see that in Russia, but you see that in China, in other authoritarian regimes. And this is such an amazing story of how they established control, right? So you're talking now about what happened in the early 2000s as Putin comes into power, and the erosion, right, of freedom, and the shift from where you were when you were in your late 20s and you could criticize the government, you could vote for another candidate, you could be vocal about it. So I mean, I think this is so important for you to please continue telling this story, right, of the erosion of freedom, and how Putin in particular consolidated power and created this authoritarian regime that we see today.
Yeah, the unfortunate part of the whole situation was that population had completely abstained. And here's also an important part. Americans should understand this. Generally, Russians have never accepted dismantling of democratic institutions. Like all the time, like all these past 20 years, if you ask them in opinion polls, do they support abolishing direct elections of city mayors or regional governors, that will be a healthy 2/3 no, all the time. Second thing, parties which supported abolishing democracy were never, popular beyond really a very marginal level. It was even current Putin's rhetoric is like, we have a democracy. People still have a say. Nobody's admitting that this is a dictatorship. And there are many other criteria which shows that Russians really like to have influence on politics, but they were deprived from that against their will. However, in the early Putin's years, they abstained. Everybody was so pleased with unexpected and very fast economic growth. Just to let you know, during first 8 years of Putin in power, average GDP growth was 7% a year on average, and average growth of real disposable income was over 12% a year for 8 years in a row. Now, when folks like myself and late Boris Nemtsov were publishing reports and speaking out against Putin at that time, people said, "You crazy."
Boris Nemtsov, we should say, who was assassinated by Putin, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. Assassinated by Putin on the bridge right near the Kremlin wall.
Right outside the Kremlin. Absolutely.
He was my co-author and friend. And in early Putin's years, everybody criticized us, saying, folks, you may be right in terms of criticizing the general direction, but economic growth, you can't beat that. This is why Putin gained so much initial popularity. And this is why, unfortunately, people in mass have abstained from politics. That was the biggest mistake of Russians, because when they found out that growth has ended long ago, it was like 2008, as they say, was the last year when Titanic saw daylight. Since then, for almost 14 years in a row, Russia haven't seen meaningful economic growth. We have been warning of that, but it became too late because people were already deprived of political rights and could not influence the situation anymore.
And really, what's interesting is that's around the same time when Putin became more brazen internationally, right? So you have the 2007 Munich speech, you have the massive cyber attacks on Estonia in that same year, you have the invasion of Georgia in 2008. Can you describe this kind of transition from the period of economic growth and Putin consolidating power, right, and gaining power and control, and then how that related to what he was doing externally? And of course, there are examples earlier than that, the manipulation of the election in Ukraine, 2004. But really, I think 2007, to me at least, seems like a break point when Putin was becoming much more aggressive internationally. Can you describe like what he was trying to achieve? And how that, what was your perspective on that period of time from 2007 on?
First, I have to say three things. First, this new imperialist anti-Western policy trend had emerged long before Putin. And I'd say the godfather of that was Primakov, the former foreign affairs minister and prime minister of Russia. I used to work in the government when Primakov was heading foreign ministry and later became prime minister. It was already very visible that this, new big dark wave is coming from the top of the Russian power. We stopped considering America and the West as friends, as allies. There came strong Eurasianism, anti-Westernism, and so on. You remember how Primakov had diverted his plane over the Atlantic in '99 when the operation against Milosevic had started in former Yugoslavia, right? Yeah. And I come back to that same point that Putin has merged with Primakov's party. just a year after he was elected. So that was a sort of collective thinking of post-Soviet Russian nomenclatura. Now, second thing is that during first Putin's years, he tried to sort of offer the West a deal, like treat us like Saudi Arabia. I even heard it said once directly by Slava Nikonov, one of the prominent foreign policy figures in Putin's entourage. He said, at one meeting, I don't remember what this was, but he said to some high-level Americans, why do you speak democracy and values to us? Why don't you treat us like Saudi Arabia? Except that we're authoritarian, but let's be allies. We can do that.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
But this collapsed after the so-called color revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, and other post-Soviet space, which Putin clearly took as attempt of the West to go after him, to undermine him.
And you know, I think it's worth noting just quickly here that in this joint statement that Xi Jinping and Putin crafted just prior to the Olympics, they used the phrase color revolutions, that they were going to be against. So he is sort of obsessed with this idea, right? That he has to extinguish any kind of, opportunity for people in Russia demanding a say in how they're governed, right? This is what he's afraid of. He's afraid of you, Vladimir. I mean,
yes. Let me make it absolutely clear, because I was also observing these processes at close range, and these revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, and other post-Soviet countries were genuine, legitimate bottom-up movements of their own populations against the onslaught of Putin-style authoritarianism on the post-Soviet space. They all have protected against rigged elections, which were meant to install Putin-minded, Putin-like autocrats. So there's this popular talk about color revolutions as a thing that is staged from abroad. No, that's the language of Putin and Xi Jinping. What was happening in reality is that people of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and others, they were struggling against attempts of dictators to encircle them into all this.
It wasn't a revolution, sadly, but in Belarus recently. How about in Kazakhstan, right? These are,
that is very important, because if you look at the past 4 years, you see all Putin's Eurasia essentially rioting against mafia dictatorships. 2018, Armenia; 2020, Belarus and Kyrgyzstan; 2022, Kazakhstan; Russia all the time, with large-scale Navalny protests, which began 5 years ago, right? So,
and we're talking about Alexey Navalny, the main opposition figure who you know so well, who was poisoned by Putin 2 years ago and is now imprisoned in Russia.
So one of my friends, Boris Nemtsov, was murdered. Another friend of mine, Alexey Navalny, is right now sitting in jail after being nearly murdered. But my point was, it's very important that all Putin's Eurasia is burning under his feet. His Eurasian Union is rioting, actually struggling for democracy, not accepting dictatorship. Just take a look at
this is so important, Vladimir. Nobody's talking about this. Putin portrays himself as strong. He's actually extremely, I think, weak now. And he's obviously, I think, overextended. We're going to talk about Ukraine, obviously, and the horrible situation there, and the humanitarian catastrophe, and what Putin has done. But I think this is just an important point. Can you describe more about this? Right? Explain what should Americans know about this period of time of the color revolutions and people demanding a say in how they're governed? Because I think a lot of times Americans, we engage in kind of this, this thinking that, democracy is great for us, but maybe authoritarianism is better for other people, right? And we you hear what I think is kind of bigotry masquerading as cultural sensitivity sometimes when people say, well, those Russians, man, they like authoritarianism, right? I mean, the Slavic peoples or whatever. So could you explain more, about what is really happening? What are people doing to try to have a say in how they're governed?
I'll be happy to supply a lot of literature, links, studies of that. But bottom line is that for more than 20 years of Putin's rules, Russia have never accepted, majority of Russian population have never accepted abolishing direct elections, elimination of independent parties, and censorship in the media. depriving them of opportunity to have a say. If you look at any opinion poll, well, the first thing that people in Russia say that when they're asked the question, what are you most unhappy about? They say we're most unhappy about with the fact that we cannot influence the policy of our government in any way. There's ample amount of data which supports just that. So we see a lot of genuine signs of big bottom-up demand for democracy in Russia. We do not see anything on the contrary. As opposed to what many people in the West are saying that, listen, Russians are like that, they want dictatorships, but there's no empirical data that supports that. There is not a single party which advocates for dictatorship and is popular. There is not a single poll which would say Russians would voluntarily give up their rights. No, they want them back, even according to official Kremlin polling data. So coming back to Putin and the color revolutions, I think Putin understood a long time ago that there will come a moment when the Russian people will also claim freedom, pretty much as the people of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and the others. He knows that, which is why all that he's been doing in the past few years is doubling down on censorship, doubling down on repression. We now have 2.5 times more official political prisoners than we had in Brezhnev and Andropov times in late Soviet Union, 2 times more, right? I think it's a general pattern. If you look at Maduro in Venezuela, Assad in Syria, Lukashenko in Belarus, the pattern is these regimes completely understand that they can only survive against the will of the people through extreme brutality.
And also, Vladimir, I think this is a true statistic, is that there are more people in the internal security services in Russia than there are in the Russian military overall, right? And
exactly.
And this is not a sign of strength, I don't think. This is a sign of weakness, right? And
right, exactly.
And so, okay, I'm resisting the temptation to fast forward to today, because there's so much rich material in between, 2007 and 8, which we talked about, and today. But we have to talk about today, right? We have to talk about what has happened in Ukraine, this assault on the Ukrainian people, which, of course, it didn't begin just in the last month in 2022, but began really, I would say, with Putin's reign, right? In the 2004 manipulated election and the sustained campaign of subversion. And of course, the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So it's already been, a shooting war for a long time, for 8 years. So how did this happen, right? And could you help us understand what people are struggling to understand? What is happening inside Russia against the backdrop of this invasion and the war that we're all watching kind of with horror and with deep emotion for the Ukrainian people and how they're suffering?
Yeah, first, several points to conclude about how we came to that. First, it was clear that Putin began to view the West as an existential enemy, not even because the West was doing something, but because it presented a role model, a democracy model, which was far more attractive. This is actually why Soviet Union fell. Because
Vladimir, I just want to highlight this, right? I want to highlight this because in America, you hear the John Mearsheimer realist school of, we caused this, which is profoundly arrogant to think that we caused it, right? I think, as you're mentioning, Vladimir Putin has aspirations beyond those that are in reaction to what we do, right? So could you just expound on this idea that, that the West caused this with NATO enlargement? I mean, could you I think our viewers, it's super important to hear your perspective on this.
Now, when I was working in the government in late Yeltsin, early Putin's years, there were a lot of people in Russian elite. Now, listen, that's important, who were openly saying it's actually very good that Eastern Europe has joined NATO, because they will receive some kind of document that they are protected now, and maybe they will stop hating us and view us suspiciously. And we begin opening borders, harmonizing legislation, creating common market, and that sort of stuff. Many really high-ranked, top-ranked people in the Russian government have been saying just that. And I think this was a very right concept, that NATO enlargement towards Central and Eastern Europe was a very good thing because it eliminated this potential threat. They now feel protected, so we'll be just fine. We'll be friends.
Right. Right.
Putin and the revanchist folks, they have a very
like France and Germany, right? I mean, historic enemies who are now, part of the EU, right? Yeah.
Right. And so actually, we had this idea 20 years ago. I mean, me and my colleagues, reformers in the government, we had this idea that let's drop all the imperial past. Let's really create this joint European space, open borders, common market, common investment space, and the free movement of people. I mean, let's just build, because we knew the enormous economic benefits of that, economic benefits of peace, open borders, and trade. And there was such an opportunity. Russia could have been a totally different country by now. We really could have taken off if we just went down this road and not Putin's imperialistic road. But the imperialistic road, again, which I would reiterate, it began not just with Putin, but much earlier with folks like Primakov. I think it was a tragic mistake for Yeltsin to appoint Primakov anywhere in the 90s. Foreign minister, prime minister, give him a lot of political weight. It was a tragic mistake. The real start of Russian anti-Westernism in politics began with Primakov. So the thing is that, first, Putin, in his rising authoritarian and neo-imperialist policies, he claimed the post-Soviet space as his exclusive zone of influence. And you cannot say that you control post-Soviet space if you do not control Ukraine. That's a jewel in the crown. With all due respect, the rest is not as important and significant as Ukraine. So he was terribly wounded when he actually lost Ukraine 2 times. First in 2004 with the Orange Revolution and the election of Viktor Yushchenko as president. Second time in 2014 with Maidan. He suffered a terrible wound. He was bleeding all these years and thinking of how can I take it back. I think his decision to finally strike militarily came out of 2 considerations. First, he exhausted options to destabilize Ukraine through, hybrid war, coercive, and through political means. There are no pro-Putin forces in Ukraine anymore who can theoretically come to power. And second, let me be absolutely frank with you. At this particular moment, he considered the West to be particularly weak. Divided.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think this is super important, right? Deterrence, somebody like Putin, is, I think, a simple equation of capability times will. And I think he believes that our will in the West was 0, right? And this is the disastrous surrender and evacuation of Afghanistan. This is, the vitriolic partisanship that we see here in the United States. It is, it's this, he saw Olaf Scholz in Germany, an SPD party, now chancellor in a weak coalition government. Macron is facing re-election. You have Boris Johnson is being, attacked because of, having parties during COVID. I mean, so I think he looked at the whole scene, and I think what people should do is they should read the joint statement of Xi Jinping and Putin just prior to the Olympics. It's all arrogance. It's the freedom, democracy is over, right? Bandwagon with us, this new era of international relations. And I think, Vladimir, I think there's an analogy back to 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine then and the annexation of Crimea, which I think is a direct result, of the unenforced red line in Syria, in 2013-14. So could you just describe a little bit more about this perception of weakness and how Putin was emboldened?
General, if I may, you stolen my words, because I was just going to say these 2 things about Germany and France. Okay. It's no coincidence that Putin have chosen this moment, because he really considered new German government to be a very weak part of the chain. And also upcoming election, also your viewers and listeners should know more about relations between Russia and France. French political and business elite is, well, first, unfortunately, there's a very strong anti-American sentiment there. Let's be frank about it.
And you know, and it's been that way kind of since the 1870s, sadly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right?
Second thing, I have never confronted the situation in any other major Western capital. When you come to Paris and meet with mid-level and top-level officials, they would, not me, I mean, they would start to talk about how sanctions are hurting French economy. French farmers losing the Russian market. We need to lift them, the sooner the better. So if you look at the array of French presidential candidates now, Emmanuel Macron, with all that we know about him, he's still the strongest anti-Putin guy. All the others actually are advocating for being much softer on Putin.
Well, which is why in the previous election, when Macron was elected, you know, Putin did everything he could to undermine Macron's candidacy. Right. Yeah, right.
Exactly. And Putin was supporting Francois Fillon, who was a front runner, but then surprisingly collapsed a few months before the election, and then was given board seats. I mean, very highly paid board seats at Sibur and Zarubezhneft oil and petrochemical company. So
it's a great gig, Vladimir, if you can get it, like sitting on a board seat of a Russian state-owned enterprise. This is, you know, of course, Gerhard Schroeder is the you know, the former chancellor of Germany, is the kind of the poster child for that, right?
And listen, that's important. What you are doing there on the board, you're receiving up to $1 million a year for nothing, because they have like 20, 25 board meetings a year. You know, I was on the boards, I was managing some of the Russian top state companies when I was in government. 20, 25 board meetings a year. Now, 90% of them take place in absentia. They don't even meet and discuss stuff, not even on Zoom. They just signed the papers, which is already.
I'm reminded, Vladimir, of the Dire Straits song, right? You know, money for nothing.
Money for nothing. Yeah, exactly. So that's. I mean, this is a bribe. This is a bribe in a very direct sense of the word. But coming back, I mean, really, Putin was counting of the weak and divided West, particularly Germany and France being an absolutely weak links in that regard. And also, I think he was really happy that he saw some fractures in the transatlantic relationships between America and Europe.
So this is so important, right? He uses our divisions against us, and he uses avarice against people, right? There is an. Could you describe a little bit more about the international criminal enterprise associated with the Kremlin, with Putin, with the Siloviki, with the the oligarchs who are this sort of outer circle? I mean, how does it operate, and why is it important for people to understand?
First, I have to say there are different estimates of the total capital flight from Russia during the past 20 years of Putin's rule. But the least estimate is $1 trillion, probably more. Money were siphoned out of Russia into various pockets in offshores and elsewhere, which is a lot of this money is being used to subvert the Western system, corrupt Western businessmen and politicians, and turn them into willful allies of Putin. Which is why I think right now, I know something because I still have a lot of people whom I know working in Putin's system, and I do have some information about what's going on in there. Putin is absolutely shocked by the extent of unity that is taking place right now in response to his aggression in Ukraine, particularly with regard to going after the oligarchs, their assets, their luxurious properties, and so on. He did not really expect this to happen, but you got to understand that's a very important tool of eroding Western democracies. And last year, I actually written a report. We'll be happy to share that with your viewers. A report for Boris Nemtsov Foundation about Putin's malign influence and network of influence in Western Europe, specifically listing all these various influential players who were actually recruited for money, specifically to promote Putin's interests. So he counted on this nefarious web of influence before the aggression, so that will somehow stop a firm and united, solidified Western response. He grossly miscalculated.
He did, yeah. So let's maybe pick up on that, right? So if you look at his decision-making process prior to this invasion of Ukraine, this special military operation, right? I mean, there were a number of assumptions I think he made that turned out to be completely false, right? You mentioned he expected disunity. Well, he got unity. He expected a tepid response, but he got a very strong response, at least economically, right? He expected the Russian military to perform extremely well in this coup de main against Kyiv, and you know, I think our viewers should look at the victory statement that was released by mistake, right, by the Kremlin, and you could see how optimistic they were. They thought the Ukrainians, you know, didn't have an idea of a nationalist identity, and they would fold. And you know, this guy Zelensky, right? He's an actor, right? He's a ballroom dancer, right? Compared to the shirtless man on horseback of Vladimir Putin. So all of these assumptions turned out to be false. Can you kind of, what is your perspective? How did Putin get this so wrong?
Well, I'd say two major miscalculations that he made, apart from misjudging on the Western unity, is first, he underestimated Ukrainian will to resist. But this is, I think it's not just Putin being crazy, it's the general sentiment of this new imperialist Russian elite.
Yeah.
They really think of Ukrainians, they don't believe that they're an independent nation. They think of them as
this is the, you know, this is his, you know, the Putin version of history, right? That was published last summer, right? The 6,000-word essay under his name.
Listen, I was struck when I was working in private sector and then in the government in the 90s. I was struck to hear this stuff from the mouths of many influential Russian policymakers. I was absolutely shocked by that crap, that many of the members of the Russian elite really believe that Ukraine is not an independent nation, it's just some form of bad Russians, you know, some dialect or something. So, and this is a tale, it just goes well beyond Putin. This is a tale that they themselves, many of those oligarchs and folks sanctioned now, they have been feeding this crap themselves for years.
You're making so many darn important points, right? Because I think the popular perception these days is this is one man, right? One man is the reason why we have this catastrophe, but it's not. It's broader than this, as you're describing. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is just I think worth amplifying that this is a sentiment shared, you know, between Putin and those around him who support his agenda.
So when Putin came to power, there were two different camps in the Russian elite. One camp said that we need to reform, we need to treat our neighbors as equal sovereign nations. We need all to move towards building a common, free, democratic European space and free common market. I was part of that team. But Putin squeezed us all from the government, and people who are ruling this country now, that's beyond Putin, that's a collective thinking. That there is no such thing as independent Ukraine. We should completely subdue them. And really, I think many decision makers thought that Ukrainians are simply very corrupt and fearful people. They will just throw down their weapons and run away.
Sure. Yeah.
That's a serious miscalculation beyond just Putin's personal mind. Many Russian elite members share that view. And second thing, obviously, they clearly overestimated the capabilities of the Russian army, but I have been speaking volumes about that. This is actually why I thought that the invasion won't happen, because with such a weak army, we cannot get involved in that sort of effort. And this is really something I don't get until this very point. Why did he do this? Essentially knowing that he knew that our military was not capable of undertaking such a major exercise, which is why I think we now have reports that they really counted for just 3 days of blitzkrieg, and they did not even prepare supplies, maintenance, and all other stuff beyond just these 3 days, which means that he really calculated on effective Ukraine surrender. He didn't really think that Ukrainians would resist. He thought that they would run away. So I think these things are connected. He knew that he had some major weaknesses in the army, but he still went for it because he just thought that Ukrainians simply won't resist.
Right. And you know, I'll tell you, I'm not surprised about the performance of the Russian military either, right? And you know, what you've been describing is a corrupt government, a corrupt system, and the military was corrupted as well, right? In terms of, leadership, lack of training, really lack of resources as well. I think a lot of people look at the defense budget of Russia, $68 billion, 3% of GDP. They think, well, that's pretty formidable. But really 2/3 of that goes to the corrupt enterprise of their defense industry, right? And very little of that goes to the military itself. I mean, most Russian soldiers make about $540 a month, right?
That's the average pay. Yeah.
Right. So could you say a little bit more about the weakness of the Russian military, and why did so many people, not get it, not understand that there were these frailties and weakness there?
Well, first I have to say that you're absolutely right. General, it's not just corruption, but it's also corruption within corruption. Because when people say that Russia has a big military budget, just up to 3% of GDP, now that might be a fascinating figure, but we should always remember that about 2/3 of that goes not to the military, but to the arms manufacturing complex.
Yes. Yeah.
And under Putin, what Putin did in the military hardware manufacturing? He completely destroyed all the competition. Now, even Joseph Stalin understood the darn importance of competition between different design bureaus, different producers. He always maintained a competitive environment.
This is why you get the T-34 tank, as an armor officer, right? You get it's innovation.
So you gotta have Boeing. Just imagine you didn't have Boeing versus Lockheed Martin, and there was just one producer. This one producer would be always coming at you saying, "I just need more money for less delivery and less quality," as it turns out in there. So that's what Putin did. He built a bunch of united corporations. He eliminated all the competition. And then, this is so funny. In a few years ago, in one of his recent public addresses, he complained, how is it possible that military hardware producers increase their prices up to 11-fold against what was initially agreed when the contract was signed? Now, somebody give him a book on economy, how economy works and what is monopolism. Monopolism destroys efficiency. It leads to higher price, lower quality. This is actually what we see. We see many Ukrainians actually doing photos with Russian cruise missiles or Caliber missiles, which never exploded and just went on hitting through asphalt and something. That's quality of the Russian military hardware manufacturing. Now, the army left with crumbles from this table. It's terribly underpaid, under-equipped. Why am I saying this? You just got to look at these pictures of poor Russian soldiers, of Russian vehicles which are absolutely not serviced for a month or so.
That's right. Broken down, right? Absolutely. Tires dry rotted from not moving.
Tanks stranded because there is no fuel supply system in place, and so on. So, this is corruption within corruption within corruption. Now Putin's learned the hard lesson. Then corruption is not just an unpleasant buzz from folks like Navalny or Milov, right? That's a real systemic problem which can collapse everything, including his military incursion. He now learns it the hard way.
Yeah. Vladimir, okay, so there's so much to talk about. We have to kind of wrap this up at some point, but I want you to come back. But so, I know what our viewers want to know. They want to know, what do you think happens next, right? You've seen all of Putin's assumptions were wrong, right? Ukraine didn't collapse. Zelensky was a strong, not a weak leader. His military was weak because of the corruption that you described, and of course, what this military can still do a lot of damage, right? It doesn't take a lot of military competence to rubble cities, whether it's Kharkiv or Mariupol. Now, Kyiv is under assault. His eyes are on Odessa. Vladimir, I don't think he can pull it off. He can't do it, I don't think. But what is your assessment? What do you think happens next? How do you see I think he's already failed. What do you think? And then how does we get to some kind of a resolution of this, right? That it addresses the humanitarian crisis, that ensures that Putin fails, right? Because he has to fail here, because he'll continue this campaign, as you mentioned. The campaign has been on since 2000. So what's your what is your diagnosis of the situation now, and what is your prognosis, right, for what's going to happen in the future?
First, I agree that yes, he already lost because it was either a blitzkrieg win or a loss, and Ukrainians' will to resist is growing by the day, because I see that during the first days they really counted on NATO military intervention, but during the past 3 weeks they actually learned they have to fight by themselves. Yes, they are supplied with weapons and other stuff, but they have to fight themselves. They have sufficient will and motivation to fight and resist, and we saw that happen. Now, the motivation of the Russian army to continue the fight is zero. Zero. I think, contrary to what
I mean, I think that's so important, right? This is important to know, right? I mean, military prowess isn't the number of tanks you have, right? It's will, fundamentally. But please go on. This is really an important perspective.
I think, contrary to what propaganda is saying on television, I'm sure Russian military servicemen, they really understand what kind of exercise they're being involved right now. They really see that they're destroying peaceful Ukrainian towns and villages, right? They're killing innocent people. You see, I mean, I saw a lot of interviews of detained Russian military servicemen detained by Ukrainians. This is actually what I expected them to say, that, yeah, we fully realize what we do. You cannot keep the morale in this sort of exercise, right? And many of the real combat-ready forces have been decimated during the first few weeks of campaign. So Putin can only continue to bombard Ukrainian cities. He cannot advance. At some point, he will have to concede defeat in his initial plan to capture major Ukrainian cities and most of Ukrainian territory. Now, what happens then? That's important, because history tells us that significant military defeats basically lead to turbulent domestic political events. Happened in 1905 with the loss of war to Japan, happened after the First World War, happened after the war in Afghanistan. So I think I'm against, trying to portray this rosy picture that Putin would immediately collapse, but he suffered such a major structural blow to the integrity of his whole system, which will also endure because Western sanctions are not going away, and they will not be reconsidered before he really changes his policy and makes a big policy U-turn.
He's a pariah. He's an international pariah.
And that will take a heavy toll on Russian economy. So many people who are still unaware of what's really going on, which is being hidden by propaganda, they will ultimately wake up. And that's important. So that will be probably a much longer and harder road than we can hope for. But this is, I think, the beginning of the end of Putin's system. Ultimately, in the longer term, it will not survive the blow to its structural integrity that we are seeing today.
You know much better than I do, but I think you're right about that. But what people are worried about, Vladimir, is like he's on his way down. How much damage can he do, right? So everybody's worrying these days about a couple of things. One is the dog that didn't bark, which is cyber attacks, right? And of course, Putin has rattled his nuclear saber as well. So for those who are concerned about what might happen next, and who think that we shouldn't do more to support the Ukrainians because they're worried about these sort of elements of power that he still controls. What is your prediction in terms of how much more damage can Putin do, right? And what are the implications for U.S. and European and NATO policy relevant to Ukraine?
First, he can do a lot of damage. Vladimir Putin is an extremely dangerous man. He's a ruthless murderer with total disregard for human life and dignity. I think all the world knows that now. Yeah. So, but listen, I haven't been through all this myself. I prefer to speak about this matters calmly. We need to calmly prepare to deter him, given that all these scenarios are possible. And I think, I don't remember what this was, but I saw one of the recent publications. There's an array of them coming right now with all this situation, but somebody said that the West and NATO should actually try to get itself out of fear of escalation, because this is something Putin knows, that many people in NATO countries and the Western countries are afraid that he will do something which will escalate the situation. I think overcoming the fear is very important.
I'll tell you, Vladimir, I cannot agree with you more, right? Stop using his language. Stop saying World War III. Stop talking about all the things you're not going to do, right? I mean, how does it doesn't work, right? When you talk about everything you're not going to do, just don't say anything about it.
Exactly, because Putin will exploit
it.
Single
Absolutely.
one weakness of yours, and this is what he's been doing all along. So don't show him any signs of weakness. Right. That is, I think, morally, emotionally, that's the strongest deterrent, because it's also a game of nerves. So you have to show some strength, that you are not afraid of an absolute. There are no prohibitive scenarios in defending the world, defending freedom, defending democracy, right? Defending everything that you hold dear in the Western civilization. So while he feels that you have a weakness, he might attack. He likes to use the cracks in the pavement. He goes there where there's the weakest part. As we just discussed, why he launched this aggression now, because he saw weak links, Germany, Ukraine, cracks between America and its European partners.
Afghanistan, absolutely.
Right. Don't show him weakness, and calmly, without emotion, prepare for different scenarios. But I have to say that there's a quote which I can use from Dmitry Rogozin, one of the key Putin's allies and head of Roscosmos space agency at the moment. 9 years ago, you can Google it on the Russian internet. He given a lecture which was called "Russia will lose a war to America in 6 hours." Meaning that that was a very public speech. Rogozin was a high-ranked policy official at the time. He really recognized that Russia doesn't stand a chance in a direct military confrontation with the West. He described in detail basically how you're gonna cook us, right? So essentially, I think you need to stop being afraid. Many people, I see fear in the eyes of many Western politicians when they talk about potential confrontation with Putin. Remove the fear, analyze the situation and the available options of deterrence calmly. You have a lot of opportunity. In the confrontation, Putin doesn't stand a chance. When he feels that strength, when he feels that resolve, he will back off.
I think an analog to this is, it's obviously the risk of action is always quite apparent, but I think some people don't factor in the risk of inaction, right? And timidity. So the last question, because I mean, this is, I think, maybe going to be the longest Battlegrounds episode, but to me, it seems the shortest because I've learned so much, and this is so important for our audience to know what's happening internally in Russia right now, right? I mean, people want to know, right? Putin's doing everything he can to shut down access to external sources of information. We saw this brave Russian television producer, right, who came out with her sign, protesting the war, who's probably going to go to jail now for 15 years, right, for if you say anything against the government. We've seen journalists as well as opposition politicians, obviously, who you've known, murdered. So we don't really know, what are the Russian people thinking? So could you, I know that you know, because you have so many friends and contacts, what's happening internal to Russia because of what's happening in Ukraine, the economic sanctions, all of the assumptions now being demonstrably false, the casualties Russians have experienced, and we should say sadly too, right? I mean, we are obviously heartbroken about what's happened to Ukrainians, but it's also a loss for Russians who are dying in this conflict. So what's happening internal to Russia?
Russia is experiencing a very difficult, painful, and sobering awakening from all these, years of comatose geopolitical fantasy that was constructed by Putin's propaganda. And really, you got to understand that this is a tooth and nail fight for the hearts and minds of every single Russian. Like what I'm saying to my viewers and Navalny Live channel, my YouTube channel, we have millions of viewers and very much increased audience in the past few weeks of the conflict. And what I keep saying is that you got to talk to everybody around you and try to convince just one person a day, one person a week, okay, one person a month. Just anybody is very helpful. Tell them the truth. Try to get them away from this, none of Putin's propaganda, imperial propaganda reality. That works. What we do know based on opinion polling data, that is fresh data that is coming from Russia, is that public opinion is changing by the day. The more people are learning that this is not just a small-scale peacekeeping operation in Donbass, but a full-scale war and assault on peaceful Ukrainian cities, you will see more of that episodes like this brave employee of Channel 1 coming out on the air with anti-war slogan, Marina Ovsyannikova. You'll see more of that. You'll see more of that awakening. However, it's a very hard job because there's a brutal censorship involved. There's new draconian laws introduced that Russians might get up to 15 years in jail for denying the peacekeeping role of Russian military forces, So up to 15 years in jail, that's pretty scary. That's pretty scary for Russians. I have to say so much admiration for many, like millions of brave people who continue to spread the word of truth. Many of them come to protest in the streets. You will see
well over 1,000 people arrested every day, right? Isn't it?
Yeah,
I think it's
exactly. So about 20,000 people arrested overall across the country. That's a township. 20,000 people. That's a township that was arrested across the country since the invasion began and the protests against the invasion began. But again, this awakening is happening. It might not be too fast, might be painful. But again, I believe deep in my heart that Russia is a normal, peaceful society. Yeah. It wants freedom. It wants democracy. It wants to live at peace with everybody else. Yeah, Putin had injected this drug of new imperialist fever, and this drug was somehow working. But I mean, it will go away. We are right now, at this very minute, we are doing all we can to actually talk to millions of Russian people and make this imperial fever go away. I think the future is with us, not with Putin.
Well, Vladimir, you're an inspiration to me. I'm sure to our viewers. I think that we have had a crisis of confidence here. You've witnessed it, right, in the West and in America. As we watch Ukrainians fight for their freedom, as we watch who advocate for the freedom of the Russian people, I think this is maybe a time for us to take at least a moment to celebrate the freedoms that we enjoy, right? And to resolve to cherish those freedoms, and to strengthen our democratic institutions and processes. So thank you for helping us understand better a real battleground in Ukraine, but really a battleground for freedom and for democracy. And I on behalf of the Hoover Institution, I can't thank you enough, and I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. It was a real pleasure, and thank you very much for your support. We really appreciate the support from all the free people of the world.
Well, how could we not support somebody who's engaged in such a virtuous and important mission? So thank you, Vladimir. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.